Well, in some ways, my sermon has already been preached. I couldn't see who said suspicious. But honestly, as I was sitting here reflecting on that, isn't that the way we oftentimes respond to the treasure God gives, with suspicion? Can it really be that good? Can it really fix the brokenness that I've come in here with this morning? Can there really be peace in my life? And am I good enough to receive it? Suspicion. We continue to follow our rabbi through these lectionary texts from Matthew. And he speaks to us most often these weeks in parables. The last two parables that we have looked at over these last 2 Sundays came with an explanation. But these rapid fire 5 parables come with no explanation here. And so we are invited to ponder Jesus' words and attempt to decipher what this message means in our lives this morning. And so you are invited, we are invited to accept this invitation by turning in our Bibles and digging into the Word, Matthew 13, beginning there in that verse 31. The first 2 parables address God's action in the world. Verse 31, the kingdom of heaven is like a what? Mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree. Now, this parable has most often been reduced to this idea that from small beginnings, right, comes great endings. But such a reading, such an understanding overlooks the parabolic difficulty that possesses, because you see, in iniquity, that mustard seed was not something that you wanted in your garden. That tiny seed would get mixed in with all the others and would grow and begin to take over valuable garden space. Kind of like kudzu or mint. A value, yes, but not the kind that you want to take over the whole garden. And so it would be treated then like a weed, pulled out, discarded. Why is Jesus describing God's growth in the world like a seed that we treat like a weed? Well, then in verse 33, Jesus tells us that the kingdom of heaven is like what? Yeast mixed into 3 measures of flour. Now that's enough flour to make enough bread for a whole wedding party. So could we also reduce this parable again to this idea that just from a little comes a lot? But again, we have to understand what we're talking about, because what we're not talking about are these little yellow packets of yeast from our modern day kitchen. But instead about a leavening agent that was understood to symbolize corruption and impurity. Why? Because this is a yeast that's created by taking an old loaf of bread, tearing off a chunk, laying it there on the counter to rot and spoil so that it can become the leaven for the next batch. Why is Jesus describing God's action in the world like rotting bread used to leaven? Might Jesus be reminding us that God's growth is often found in the least likely of places and comes in the least likely of ways? In places that we, as the world, call weeds, and in ways that might seem unclean or even unproductive. Could Jesus also be inviting us to understand God's power to grow in all things, including you, including me? This morning, no matter what we brought in here in our hearts. Imagine what God can do with you. Imagine what God can do with me. I want to invite you to say those words. Imagine what God can do with me. Do we imagine? Do we allow that imagination to go into our each and every living day? Is it here with us this morning? Do we imagine what God can do in and through us and in and through the others in our lives that seem more like weeds than wonder, that at times seem more corrupt than clean? I had only met Tony once. When I got the call that evening at 10 o'clock that he had been shot and in the head. Do I go to the hospital, Lord? I don't know him well, and we're so different. He's 19. He's just come out of jail, and he's in this gang that he's trying to get out of. That's the reason he was shot. Can I imagine what God can do with even me? And so I went to the hospital, and I have never felt so uncomfortable. I walked into that ICU, 15 to 20 young people gathered around there with Tony's family, wailing, already grieving, not knowing what to expect. And when the surgeon walked out, he was shaking his head no. And he said, too much damage has been done. And his mother, not in the corner, crumbled into a ball, but walking the middle of that ICU floor, claiming God's healing power and naming what she wanted. I want my son to be healed. Imagine what God can do. It had been 2 weeks. Him in a coma. He's still alive. But was he there? And then a finger began to move, and then his hand began to move. He opened his eyes, but was he behind the eyes? And then he began to speak, one word at a time. I'll never forget walking into his hospital room and seeing him sitting up. Good morning, Tony. How are you? Hi. At that point, and still today, his left side was not moving. And so I asked him, Tony, would it be okay if I anointed your left arm and we prayed for healing? Yes. And so I anointed his arm in the shape of the cross. And we closed our eyes and we prayed for that healing. And I opened my eyes and he opened his and he looked at me and he said the first sentence I had heard him say since he'd been shot. Can I anoint you? Imagine what God can do. And I can never put into words what happened when he put his finger in the oil and put the sign of the cross on my forehead. It was the same mystery that we experience when we come to the table. And in that moment, my life was changed again and forever. Imagine what God can do with me. And in the church, we want to define what that looks like, and we want to know what to expect. And then God throws it all upside down, pushes us beyond our definitions, a mustard seed, invading our sense of order, yeast rising up from what the world calls corrupt, gang members and prison, to bring us a feast for our hunger. This is what God does. And so what do? This is what God does. And so what do we do? And Jesus comes in the very next two parables to invite us into a response, a reaction to the God action that is so strong that people gladly give up everything to have the treasure that God offers. The treasure discovered in verse 44 as a farmer plows a field. And it's really cool because right before worship this morning, I discovered we have a guest farmer among us. Erica is the farmer of a 17-acre farm at Camp Chestnut Ridge, one of our Methodist camps close by. Can you imagine Erica digging in that vegetable garden and hitting a tin can rusty, old, and prying that lid off to discover a treasure. And then the jeweler, his whole business is to know the value of that pearl. And both go and invest everything they have to possess the treasure before them. And what is the treasure? Well, Paul says it well in our lectionary text from Romans, does he not? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And so how great is our response? How great is our excitement when we understand that we have discovered the meaning of true living? Or is our excitement great? I want you to imagine with me 24 hours from now, tomorrow morning around this time, 11:30-ish. Picture in your mind where you'll be. Work, camp, with your children, in your community center, sitting down with a neighbor, on a mission trip near Fayetteville. If those that are around you 24 hours from now were asked about you, if you carry God's treasure of hope in your life, would they say yes? Now picture yourself just a few hours later, tomorrow, early evening, dusk. You're home. You're eating dinner, you're walking the dog, you're out running, you're coming in contact with friends, you're texting, you're talking to a neighbor. If they were asked, if you've discovered God's greatest treasure in your life, what would they say? And now imagine with me, tomorrow evening when the sun has set, you're closing your door wherever that door is. And behind those doors, you are with spouse, you are with child, you are with roommate, you are with friend, you are with your God. And in that space, is there that treasure of joy that permeates? That's the foundation for even the worst argument, even the darkest bout of depression. A joy that is foundational even in the worst types of tragedies in our lives. You know the treasure and you know it's yours. But knowing the treasure and investing in that treasure are two different things. I was about 8 years old when my parents bought their first home, an old home, as in over 100 years old. It had been my mom's dream forever to own an old home in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, to remodel that place. And for the first couple of years, they did small renovations until they built up enough money to begin, knocking down some walls and tearing at plaster. They picked up those sledgehammers and they began to push into that plaster, and to their surprise, right behind that plaster that had been there for years and years was a treasure. We had no idea. Thick logs. The front of our home was a log cabin. And in between the logs, they found bottles, postcards. And my parents invested in the treasure by calling in Civil War experts from the local museum. These bottles, these are medicine bottles. We think that this home was used as a hospital during the Civil War, and these postcards are words writ from a soldier to his beloved. And my parents invested a step further by sharing that treasure, placing those donations in a museum in the Shenandoah Valley. I looked up the word invest this morning, dictionary.com, and I was surprised what I found. To invest is to furnish something with power and authority and rank. Jesus is inviting us to hold this treasure and to invest in it, to give it power and authority and rank in our lives. Is this not what discipleship is? Investing in the treasure before us, investing in God's word in our lives every day, investing in time in our faith relationships, investing of money in God ministry, investing of minds on things that bring us closer to God, investing of ourselves in worship. Because you all come here, and I don't lead you. We together are called to invest in worship and to understand again that treasure. You know the treasure. The question is, will we invest? The treasure is yours and is mine because we were first his treasure. One of you pointed this out this week while studying the scripture. What if the pearl is us? And Jesus is the one who first finds us as treasure. And in fact, the word buy, that word buy right there in verse 46, that Greek word is the same word translated redeem in other parts of the Bible. And so there's this idea that it is first Jesus who finds us, then goes and sells his life so that he might buy us, so that he might redeem us. So that when that net is cast, the very last parable in this passage, and the catch is pulled in, we will find ourselves among the treasure, God's treasure, among those treasured. We have treasure because we are first treasured. Imagine what God can do with me. Imagine what God can do with me.
Will the choir be here? No. That'll be here.
Let's get a lights out spotlight.
Nowhere else am I nervous.